She stood in the hallway of her apartment, staring at a rent notice taped to the door. Third one this year. Her shoes were still damp from the subway steps. In her backpack, no strategy memos, no campaign donations, just handwritten flyers and a stapler. Across town, the most powerful Democrat in New York sat in a glass office. His name on half the buildings in Queens, his budget 10 times hers, and his confidence even bigger. He didn't even bother to show up for the first debate. Why would he? She was just a bartender. But when the ballots came in, history didn't knock. It kicked the door down. The girl who once served drinks to cover groceries just shattered a political dynasty. Not with money, not with power, with voice, with fire, with nothing to lose. And for one electric moment, America remembered what it looked like when someone with empty pockets but a full heart walked into a rigged game and flipped the table. This dramatized story is inspired by real events. While names and core moments are drawn from public history, certain scenes have been fictionalized for emotional impact. Because even when the lines between fact and fiction blur, the feeling it leaves behind is entirely real. The chairs were too soft. That was Alexandria's first thought as she sat near the far end of the committee room, shoulders straight, lips sealed, folder resting neatly on her lap. The fabric-covered seat cradled her awkwardly, like it hadn't been designed for someone who spent most of her adult life standing on her feet. All around her, the air was stiff with suits and scripted jokes. Men with gray hair leaned across polished tables, speaking a language that was less about truth and more about comfort. The kind of comfort that came from having been here too long. They shook hands too easily, laughed too loudly, as if nothing outside these walls could reach them. Alexandria knew she was not invited to that world. She was tolerated, maybe even watched, but not welcomed. One congressman, leaning toward his aide just a little too openly, didn't bother to whisper, "The bartender from the Bronx? This must be a phase." She didn't flinch, didn't turn, just kept her eyes on the committee packet in front of her, flipping pages slowly, though she'd already read it twice. The words weren't new. The performance was. She could feel it, subtle but clear. The meeting hadn't started, but a verdict was already forming around her. Some thought she was here for show. Some thought she'd burn out within a year. A few didn't think about her at all, but none of them noticed the pen in her hand, or how she gripped it not like a prop, but like a tool, a quiet weapon. A woman from the press pool leaned in from the back bench and mouthed something to a colleague, pointing in Alexandria's direction. She caught it in the corner of her eye. The gesture wasn't cruel, just curious, as if trying to answer the question that hung silently in the air. Why is she here? She could answer that, not with a speech, not with credentials, but with a memory, one they couldn't see. The Bronx. Winter. She remembered that sting, the numb fingertips from washing cocktail glasses in freezing water because the boiler had gone out again. The noise of 3 jobs colliding in one apartment, her mother sewing by lamplight, her brother pacing the floor studying for a math test, and her reworking campaign talking points between late-night shifts. That was why she was here. Not because she fit, but because she didn't. A gavel struck. The room hushed. The chair recognized a witness. The same banker who once told a newspaper that America needed to stop over-regulating risk. His tie was perfect. His fingers well manicured. His opening remarks, flawless in form, empty in consequence. Alexandria didn't write anything down. Not yet. Instead, she watched. Carefully. Like someone watching a chessboard. Not for the pieces in play, but for the ones that hadn't moved yet. The murmur around her softened. People shifted in their seats. Eyes moved on. But one congressman, 2 seats over, glanced at her again. Then again. He didn't know why, but something about her silence. It didn't feel like absence. It felt like momentum. She sat still. Her fingers rested calmly on her folder. She wasn't there to speak yet. She was there to listen. And that, oddly, was the thing none of them were ready for. Because in a place built on voices trying to outshout one another, the quietest person in the room had just made them all uneasy. The refrigerator didn't hum when her mother opened it. Just silence, stale air, and the faint smell of leftover arroz con gandules from 3 nights ago. Again? Her mother whispered, not to anyone in particular. It wasn't a question, just a tired acknowledgement of yet another overdue bill. Alexandria stood nearby, coat still on, watching the lightless kitchen with the familiar ache of someone who already knew the answer. It was January, and the Bronx did what it always did that time of year. It bit. The cold didn't knock. It seeped in through windows that never fully sealed, through tiles that felt like stone, through water pipes that hissed with protest when asked to do the simplest thing: keep a family warm. That night, like many others, they boiled pots of water on the stove. Steam fogged the windows. Her mother laid out 2 plastic buckets in the tiny bathroom. It wasn't a bath, it was a system. Alexandria pulled off her boots and sat by the radiator that only clicked but never heated. She pressed her socked feet against it anyway, out of habit. The bar shift had been long, but she'd taken it because she needed the extra cash. Not for luxuries, just to keep the lights on. Except tonight, that wasn't enough either. In her bedroom, really a corner of the hallway, where a curtain pretended to be a door, she opened her laptop. The Wi-Fi lagged. Her inbox was mostly campaign rejections, local papers ignoring her press releases, volunteers canceling shifts, another neighborhood council postponing their forum until further notice. And then she saw it, a headline buried in a political blog. Crowley's campaign wore chest tops, $3 million. She blinked, opened the article. It wasn't even framed as big news, just a footnote to the political reality of Queens and the Bronx. Joe Crowley, the 4th most powerful Democrat in the House, was running unopposed. Again. The piece called him untouchable, a staple of stability, and a sure win for Democrats this cycle. AOC read it twice, not out of disbelief, but because something else was rising in her throat. Not fear, not even anger, a calm defiance. Familiar. Like the quiet you hold just before you decide to do something no one expects. She turned to the wall behind her bed. There, tacked between old sticky notes and a faded photo of her abuela, was her campaign map. 10 districts, dozens of apartment buildings, hundreds of doors. The pins looked like tiny rebellions. But in that moment, they didn't feel like decoration. They felt like possibility. She opened a new tab, not to read more political analysis, but to double-check her budget. It was laughable. Just over $7,000 in the bank. Her personal savings were lower. Her rent hadn't been paid in weeks. But her calendar still had canvassing blocks highlighted in yellow. That was something money didn't buy. Persistence. Her mother walked in, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're still working?" she asked, not surprised, just concerned. Alexandria nodded. "They say he's got $3 million, she muttered. Her mother leaned in, read the headline over her shoulder, and then did something that startled them both. She smiled. "Good," she said softly. "Then he has more to lose." That night, Alexandria didn't sleep much. Not because of the cold or the stress or the overdue bills, but because she had an idea forming, a kind of still, burning conviction, that if the fight really was that uneven, then maybe it was finally worth picking. She closed her laptop, lit a candle from her campaign stash, and started rewriting her speech for the senior center in Jackson Heights. Not because she thought it would change everything, but because it might change someone. And sometimes that's enough to start. The next morning, the Bronx was still gray, the kind of gray that settled on rooftops and laundry lines and people's shoulders. Alexandria sat cross-legged on her small bed, knees to her chest, fingers numb from last night's cold. She was sorting through a tattered envelope labeled Abuela Old Letters. She kept it tucked between books since the funeral. Never really had the heart or time to go through it. Inside were scraps of paper, yellowed edges, and one photo of her grandmother in a checkered apron, standing proudly beside a kitchen stove, too old to belong in any modern story. But it was the note folded 4 times, pressed flat by time and heat, that stopped her. She opened it carefully, a page torn from a notebook, written in rounded, slightly shaky Spanish. Nuestra voz importa. Our voice matters. No signature. None needed. It was her abuela's handwriting, gentle but certain. Alexandria could almost hear her saying it, the way she used to after a neighbor got evicted, or after the superintendent forgot to turn the heat on for the third straight week. She'd whisper it while stirring a Roz, as if declaring it into the beans themselves. Alexandria stared at the note for a long time, then got up, found a thumbtack in the bottom of a mug full of pens, and pinned it just above her desk, between her campaign budget sheet and a photo of her and her brother on graduation day. The paper fluttered slightly as if breathing. No voice should feel too small to matter. Not anymore. Not here. She closed her eyes and exhaled. That was the moment, quiet, not loud, when the decision settled. Not as a sudden idea, but as a returning truth. She wasn't going to wait to be asked. She was going to run. By noon, she was standing at the Board of Elections, alone. No staffers flanking her, no press trailing, no cameras waiting outside. Just a canvas tote bag with a granola bar, a crumpled Metro card, and a folder of printed out forms. The clerk barely looked up. "Are you filing?" he asked. She nodded. Her hands were shaking, but not from doubt. When the last signature dried, and the woman behind the counter gave her a polite, almost surprised nod, Alexandria stepped outside into the cold air and blinked hard. There was no applause, no announcement, just the sharp slap of the wind and the sound of her boots on the pavement. But something had shifted, not in the world, but in her. She texted her mother. "It's done. I'm on the ballot." The reply came fast. "Proud of you, mija." Then a second. "Abuela would be too." Later that night, back in her room, she looked up at the note one more time. Nuestra voz importa. It didn't say mi voz, my voice. It said our. And that was the point, wasn't it? This campaign would never be about being the loudest in the room. It would be about making space for voices that had been ignored, rushed past, talked over. If Crowley had his millions, she had this. A memory, a belief, a kitchen table revolution. She pulled her red folder onto her lap and began sketching out her first speech. The one no one had asked for. The one no one expected. But that didn't matter, because her abuela was right. Their voice mattered. And now someone was finally going to carry it forward. The chairs were set in quiet little rows, just like always. Someone had brought a thermos of coffee. Someone else had left a tray of cookies on the back table, half covered in plastic wrap, like they weren't sure if anyone would come. The community center had that familiar hum of old air vents and tired lights. Nothing fancy, just enough. Alexandria arrived early, as she always did, not because she needed to, but because it felt like a kind of respect. She helped adjust the folding chairs, greeted the custodian by name, and took a quiet moment to steady herself in the mirror above the sink in the women's bathroom. Her hair was pulled back simply, her blazer one she'd worn too many times, but clean, pressed, and hers. She didn't expect a big crowd, 20 people maybe, neighborhood folks who still believed in showing up, even when the system gave them every reason not to. She had her talking points folded neatly in her bag, but more than anything, she came with the intention to listen. A man in a neat button-down arrived just before the forum began, carrying a slim briefcase and a name badge from Congressman Crowley's office. He gave a polite nod and introduced himself, not as the congressman, but as his representative for the evening. Alexandria smiled out of habit, then tucked her hands into her coat pockets to still them. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something quieter than that, something like confirmation. When the residents began to arrive, most took a second to scan the room, and then a third glance to realize Crowley wasn't there. The whisper passed from row to row like a breeze. "He sent someone again." "Figures. Hasn't been here in years." Alexandria took her seat anyway, nodding to those who entered, offering a quiet hello and thank you for coming. She didn't try to explain the congressman's absence. She let people feel what they already knew. When it was her turn to speak, she stood without hurrying. No stage voice, no performance, just the kind of tone you use when you've been invited into someone else's space and you want to honor that. "I know it's late," she said gently, "and I know this isn't the first time you've come to one of these hoping to be heard." She paused. "It's also not the first time the congressman couldn't make it." There was no malice in her voice, just truth, plain and undressed. She let her gaze move slowly across the room, meeting each set of eyes without forcing anything. And I just think, if someone won't show up when they still need your trust, then we have to ask ourselves, will they show up later when your vote's already in their pocket? There was a moment after that, quiet but not empty. The kind of silence people sit with when something lands not in their ears, but in their chest. She spent the rest of the evening not making promises, but asking questions. What was hardest for them this year? What had gotten better, if anything? Where did they feel most unseen? There were no cameras, no applause lines, just nods and sighs, and once the soft tap of someone's palm on the table in agreement. By the time the room cleared, the tray of cookies had been picked over, and the coffee was cold. Alexandria helped fold the chairs back up. No one asked her to. It just felt like the right thing to do. Only 20 people had come, but all 20 had seen the same thing. One chair left empty. One chair that was never supposed to matter, now holding more weight than anyone expected. The paper was warm when it slid out of the laundromat copier. Not crisp like campaign mailers from polished teams, but slightly wrinkled at the corners, smelling faintly of detergent and lint. Alexandria picked it up gently, checked for smudges, then set it on top of the growing stack by her elbow. She'd been here nearly an hour, feeding quarters into the machine between cycles of a stranger's laundry, her bag half open beside her feet. There was no office, no staff, just this corner and a bag full of hope. The flyer itself was simple, black and white, printed on sale bin paper from the dollar store. It had her picture, a short message, and a name few people recognized. But when she looked at it, something in her chest stirred. Not pride exactly, but a quiet kind of belief. Outside, the wind was sharper than she'd expected. The borrowed boots, half a size too small, rubbed against her heels with every step. But she didn't say anything. Her cousin had offered them with a smile, and Alexandria knew better than to complain about borrowed things. She met her team, if that's what you could call them, at the corner cafe. No matching t-shirts, no slogans, just people who cared. Janelle, who taught at the local elementary school and handed out flyers with chalk still on her fingers. Luis, her cousin, who fixed air conditioners by day and walked blocks with her at night. And Ms. Rivera, a retired nurse who moved slowly, but never forgot a face. They didn't talk strategy. They talked about who had a new baby, which building had a broken elevator again, and whether the bodega on 138th still carried those little guava pastries. Between bites of pan dulce and sips of dollar coffee, they folded flyers and mapped out streets by memory, not software. Door by door they walked, sometimes in the rain, often in the wind. Alexandria always knocked gently, like she didn't want to startle anyone, and when someone answered, she smiled with her whole face. Not everyone was kind. One man, barefoot in the hallway with a child clinging to his leg, looked her up and down and said, "You're sweet, honey, but he's untouchable." She paused, not offended, just thoughtful, then quietly replied, "So was Goliath." She didn't say it to be clever, just honest. Some doors stayed shut, some opened halfway, but every so often someone would step out, take the flyer, and ask, "Wait, this is you?" And she'd nod, a little shyly. "It is. I'm running because I think this district deserves more than someone who only shows up when it's time to vote." At the end of long days, her legs sore and her cheeks wind-chapped, she'd sit by the window in her apartment and sort through what was left. Half-used tape rolls, flyers that had gotten rained on, a marker that was beginning to dry out. It didn't look like much, but it felt like something. She looked at the note above her desk again. Nuestra voz importa. She'd read it so many times it felt more like rhythm than words now. And when doubt came, and it did in quiet waves, she didn't push it away. She just reminded herself, someone out there was waiting for a knock. And maybe, just maybe, they'd open the door. That night, the apartment was quieter than usual. The streetlight outside flickered softly through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Alexandria sat cross-legged on the mattress that doubled as her couch, her campaign folder still unopened beside her. It had been another long day. Flyers, doorsteps, smiles stretched thinner than they looked, and more questions from voters than she had answers for. Her feet ached, not just from walking, but from holding herself upright for too many hours without rest. She'd skipped dinner without meaning to. Again. The rent notice was still on the table, unopened. She didn't need to look at it. The numbers hadn't changed. And the account balance she checked that morning had only confirmed it. $7,082.43. Campaign funds. Not personal, not enough for either. The inbox was worse. Another polite decline from a progressive group she had once admired. While we appreciate your values, we've chosen to focus our support on more viable candidates this cycle. She read it twice, not because she didn't understand, just because it stung a little more than she wanted to admit. She clicked to the next one. A major union. Same message, different signature. We'll keep you in mind for the future. She closed the laptop, let her head fall into her hands. No tears. Not yet. Just the heaviness that creeps in when no one's watching. When you've used every ounce of energy to stand tall in front of others and suddenly realize there's nothing left to lean on behind the door. In that moment, she felt it. The doubt. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and quiet, like water wearing down stone. Who did she think she was? She wasn't a politician. She didn't have a PAC or a press secretary. Her team was 3 friends sharing Google Sheets and iced coffee. Joe Crowley had a war chest that could fund 5 campaigns. And here she was, barely keeping the lights on. For a second, she almost said it aloud. Maybe this isn't going to work. But before she could finish the thought, her phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. No name. Just words. Hi. I saw your video today, the one where you talked about your mom. I've never voted before, but I just wanted you to know I'm with you. She blinked. Read it again. Something about it softened the edge of her doubt. Not completely, not magically, but just enough. Enough to let breath back into her lungs. Enough to remind her that this campaign wasn't built on donations or endorsements. It was built on the possibility that someone, somewhere, was listening. She didn't text back. She didn't need to. Instead, she got up, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window, watching the streetlight flicker. Across the street, an older woman shuffled into her building, groceries in one hand, keys in the other. A kid zipped past on a scooter. Someone's music played faintly from an open car door. This was her district. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. And maybe she didn't have the most money, or the right shoes, or the endorsements, but she still had something Crowley didn't. She still believed it was worth trying, even now, especially now. So she sat back down, opened her laptop, pulled out the campaign folder, and wrote down a single line at the top of the page. One message can outlive 10 rejections. The taco bar wasn't exactly designed for politics. It was narrow, a little too warm, and filled with the kind of charm that couldn't be bought. Handwritten chalkboard menus, string lights with a few bulbs flickering, salsa music humming gently under the low thrum of ceiling fans. Alexandria sat at the back table, tucked between the kitchen door and a tilted poster of Frida Kahlo, fidgeting with the edge of her water glass. Her campaign team, if you could call it that, was gathered around her in mismatched chairs. Janelle had brought her brother along. Luis was nervously refreshing his phone even though results hadn't started rolling in yet. And Ms. Rivera had insisted on bringing tamales for the whole group even though they were technically at a taco place. Everyone had their own way of coping. Alexandria's was quiet. She hadn't eaten all day. Not out of strategy or superstition, just nerves. The kind of nerves that came when you'd given everything and were about to find out if it even mattered. The TV mounted near the bar played low. A panel of commentators sat around a polished desk, their suits sharp, their voices polished. One of them mentioned her name in passing, calling her a symbolic challenger, someone making a point, not a path. Another added with a smirk, she's done well for a first-timer, but let's be honest, this race is Crowley's to lose. She didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. Still, the words stung a little. Not because they doubted her, but because they were so certain, so casual in their dismissal, as if she hadn't walked miles for this, as if all the doors she'd knocked on, all the forums she'd shown up for, all the rent she'd gone without, that didn't count because it didn't show up in the polls. Speaking of which, 3%. That was what one of the major outlets had projected for her, a kind of statistical pity, really. Not zero, but not enough to take seriously. She looked around at her team. No one was talking about the numbers. They were passing around plates of chips, arguing softly about who made the best flan in the borough, laughing a little too loudly at jokes that weren't that funny. Not because they were in denial, but because they understood something that pollsters didn't. This wasn't about winning comfortably. This was about showing up, fully, honestly, and seeing who might show up with them. Ms. Rivera reached across the table and squeezed Alexandria's hand. "Whatever happens," she said gently, "you already did something people will remember." Alexandria nodded, a lump forming at the base of her throat. She wasn't sure if it was comfort or pressure. Her phone buzzed on the table. A volunteer had sent a photo. Two elderly women in Queens holding her flyer and smiling. No caption, just the image. It reminded her of her abuela, reminded her why she'd started. She thought of all the tiny, almost invisible moments that had brought her here. Printing flyers in a laundromat, reusing stamps, the teenager who'd handed her $1 at a subway stop because he said, "You talk like my aunt." None of it showed up in the polls, but it showed up in her bones. The first vote count was still an hour away. But as she sat there, surrounded by people who didn't need proof to believe, she felt something loosen in her chest. It wasn't confidence. It was readiness, not for certainty, but for whatever came next. She reached for a chip finally and smiled to herself. Win or lose, the story had already changed. And in this little taco bar in the Bronx, that was enough, for now. The screen above the taco bar had been on for over an hour, playing softly while conversation floated from table to table. No one was really watching anymore. The news anchors were still saying the same things they'd said for weeks. Crowley had name recognition, experience, endorsements. Alexandria was running a beautiful campaign, they added, almost like a compliment you give before moving on. Inside, the lights were warm. Someone had brought extra guacamole. Ms. Rivera was wrapping up a flan in foil for Luis to take home to his little sister. Janelle was refreshing her phone between bites, though her expression hadn't changed in 20 minutes. They were all doing their best not to think too hard about what came next. Alexandria sat near the window, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't sipped from. She was tired in a way that didn't show on the outside, just quiet, almost still, like someone holding a note too long. Then from the television, a small shift. The anchor's voice slowed, and a new headline appeared at the bottom of the screen, barely noticeable at first. But Janelle saw it. She leaned forward, squinting, and whispered, "Wait, Lex, look." Luis lifted his phone again, hesitated, then stood up slightly as if that might help. "Guys," he said, not loudly, not triumphantly, just wide-eyed. "She's ahead." The room didn't erupt. Not yet. The sound that came was more like a hush, like the moment before a curtain lifts. The anchor spoke again, this time not as fast, not as polished. "We're going to interrupt our coverage briefly. Early results in New York's 14th district show Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the lead, against longtime incumbent Joe Crowley." There was a pause, on the screen and in the room. Someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Ms. Rivera reached over and touched Alexandria's hand gently, like you would when someone is waking up from a long, uncertain dream. A quiet, stunned smile spread across Janelle's face. The bartender stopped wiping down glasses and looked up. Alexandria didn't move. Not right away. The words felt like they were echoing from far away, taking a few seconds to reach her. She looked down at her lap, then back up at the TV, where her photo had just appeared next to the word "Leads" in small white letters. The screen shifted again. More precincts reporting. The margin widened. Janelle's voice trembled slightly. "Lex, you're not just leading, you're winning." Alexandria blinked, and blinked again. Not from disbelief, but from the way something deep inside her, something long held and tightly guarded, began to loosen. A warmth spread from her chest to her fingertips. Not fire, something quieter, like breath returning. When the anchor finally said the words, "Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has unseated Joe Crowley in a stunning political upset," it didn't feel loud. It felt like a tide turning. Around her, people began to cry, laugh, hug without words. Luis covered his face with both hands. Ms. Rivera whispered a prayer in Spanish that only Alexandria could hear. The whole room held something sacred in that moment. Not victory, but recognition. Alexandria's throat tightened. She hadn't prepared a speech. Not for this. She stood slowly, no fist in the air, no tears yet. Just a small nod, almost to herself, as if the little girl who once watched her mother fold laundry in silence had finally heard someone say, "You matter. You were never invisible." And in that quiet moment, before the headlines, before the cameras, before the chaos, she let herself feel it, a small, full silence. Then gently she whispered the only thing that made sense. "Why, I think we did it." And everyone around her, without needing to be told, knew exactly what that meant. Somewhere across town, beneath stage lights that had been dimmed just enough to soften the mood, Joe Crowley stood in front of his supporters with a guitar strapped awkwardly around his shoulder. His tie was slightly loosened, his voice just steady enough to pass for graceful. He strummed the opening chords of Born to Run, his smile stretched thin, as if trying to convince the room, and maybe himself, that this was all just part of the journey, a moment of humility, a gentleman's farewell. But the song didn't land. Not really. It hung in the air with too much irony. The chords rang hollow in a space that had expected triumph. Supporters behind him shifted uncomfortably. Some clapped out of rhythm. Others looked at their phones, eyes darting across headlines they hadn't prepared for. One by one, the donors, aides, and well-wishers who had once called him unbeatable were realizing the ground had moved beneath their feet. Crowley was conceding, gently, publicly, with a guitar, yes. But behind that performance was something else, a kind of quiet collapse, not of character, but of certainty. Meanwhile, in the little taco bar, still warm with the afterglow of disbelief, Alexandria sat on the floor behind the counter, knees hugged to her chest, the noise of celebration still buzzing faintly in the room beyond. She needed a minute, not to catch her breath exactly, but to feel the shape of what had just happened. It still didn't feel real, or maybe it felt too real to be processed all at once. Her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. But the name on the screen was one she trusted, an old friend, the kind who had been with her since the earliest days when her campaign website was just a template and her meetings were held over iced coffee and shared Wi-Fi. She answered quietly. No greeting, just listened. On the other end, the voice came steady, maybe even reverent. You just cracked the establishment open. Alexandria smiled faintly. Not the kind of smile you give to be polite, but the kind that rises slowly, like a sunrise through tired bones. She didn't say thank you. She didn't cheer. What she said was simple, spoken like someone who understood exactly what it meant to break a door open. Now, she replied, let's walk in. She didn't mean her alone. She meant we, the U.S. that had been building behind her, not just her team, but the people who had trusted her without being asked to, who had opened their doors and offered their stories and their doubt, but also their hope. She stood up slowly and stepped out into the main room, where Miss Rivera was now hugging someone who looked like they hadn't cried in 20 years. Luis was trying to FaceTime his mother, but the signal kept cutting out. Janelle had tears on her cheeks and rice on her shirt. The bar owner, who hadn't said much all night, handed Alexandria a glass of water like it was a trophy. Outside, the city moved on. Taxis passed, storefronts locked up, and the lights on Roosevelt Avenue blinked as they always did. But inside that space, something had shifted. Something had been made visible. She didn't play guitar. She didn't sing a farewell. She just stood still for a moment, soaking in the quiet truth of what had happened. A bartender had just changed the story, and now she was ready to help rewrite the rest. The hall smelled like old carpet and polished wood, like something long preserved and rarely questioned. Alexandria stood quietly near the elevator, adjusting the sleeve of her thrift store blazer. It fit fine across the shoulders, but tugged slightly at the elbow every time she moved. Her shoes, worn down at the heels, made a soft tap-tap as she walked across the marble floor. Just loud enough to be heard, not loud enough to be noticed. This was her first day on Capitol Hill. She had woken up early, too early, and packed her lunch like she used to when bartending. Half out of habit, half out of not wanting to spend $12 on a sandwich. Her bag held exactly what it always had: pens, a notepad, her grandmother's note folded neatly in a side pocket, and a little envelope with $27 in it, a reminder of what small dollars could do. Inside the building, everything felt too clean, too distant. The ceiling stretched high and echoed softly, and everyone walked with purpose, as if their direction was never in doubt. Alexandria tried to do the same, but she could already feel the eyes. Not hostile, just puzzled. At the security checkpoint, the officer barely glanced up before asking, "Intern badge?" She shook her head politely. "Member." He paused, finally looking at her face, eyes flicking down to her shoes, her blazer. There was a beat of silence. Then awkwardly, he nodded her through. She didn't flinch. She'd expected this. As she made her way down the hallway, the heels of more expensive shoes clicked past her. Men in tailored suits moved in clusters, women in sharp heels and glossy hair typing furiously on phones. She felt the tug of imposter syndrome like a thread in her sleeve. But she didn't pull on it. She let it be. She had work to do. Outside the elevator, a gray-haired representative, one she vaguely recognized from C-SPAN clips, looked her over with the half-curious, half-dismissive glance of someone still learning all the new names. He smiled, more confused than unkind. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" he asked. She returned the smile. Small, still. "No," she said softly, "just new." Then she stepped into the elevator before he could answer. The doors closed. She exhaled. She thought of her mom back home, probably already telling the neighbors, already saving screenshots of articles, already pressing her hand to her chest like she always did when proud but trying to act normal. She thought of the kid on the scooter in Queens who had once asked if she was really going to be on TV someday. She thought of the campaign flyers stacked in her living room, the nights her legs had cramped from walking too far without a proper dinner. This building, with its heavy wood and hushed conversations, wasn't built for people like her. But she wasn't here to blend in. She was here because someone had to ask the questions that didn't fit neatly into policy briefs. She was here for the women balancing two jobs and still paying late fees, for the public school teachers who use their own money for crayons, for the Bronx bodega owners and subway poets and tired dads who'd stopped believing their vote mattered. The elevator dinged. She stepped out. Her steps were soft but steady, and even if no one else knew it yet, she had already begun. The halls of Congress were loud in the daytime, but the real lessons didn't happen on the House floor. They happened quietly, behind half-closed doors, over soft chuckles and paper-thin coffee, in back rooms where newcomers were offered advice that sounded like wisdom, but landed like warning. "Take your time," one senior Democrat had told her, with a kind voice and a practiced smile. "First term isn't the moment to stir the pot. Find your footing. Build trust. Don't go asking questions that make people nervous." Alexandria had nodded politely, just as her mother had taught her. Never disrespect someone offering you their version of the world. But she heard the space between the words. It wasn't guidance, it was caution, a suggestion to stay quiet long enough to be safe. But she hadn't run for safety. She hadn't campaigned through the winter just to blend into a building that had never expected her in the first place. So while others went to receptions and rounded off their evenings with fundraisers, she went home. Not to rest, but to study. Finance reports, congressional budgets, SEC filings. She printed pages until the ink ran low and spread them across her kitchen table, highlighting lines she didn't yet understand, and circling phrases like collateralized debt and non-performing assets. Some nights her eyes blurred from reading, but she kept going, whispering terms out loud until they stopped sounding foreign. She made flashcards, scribbled notes, read testimonies from banking hearings that no one talked about on cable news. Not because she liked the language of finance, but because she refused to let it be used as a gatekeeping tool. Lobbyists had noticed her, of course. Emails came with polite tones and vague invitations. Coffee chats, round tables, policy briefings hosted by organizations with names that sounded civic but were backed by banks. One offered to help guide her through the complexities of economic legislation. Another suggested she join a dinner with emerging leaders and strategic investors. She declined them all, graciously, firmly, quietly, because somewhere along the way she had learned that when power invites you to the table too quickly, it's often because they've already written the menu. So instead of dinners, she studied. Instead of handshakes, she asked questions, mostly to herself, sometimes to the overworked junior staffers who slipped her internal budget notes when no one was watching. She carried around a little black notebook, filled with hand-drawn diagrams of how public money moved through private hands. She wrote next to them in small cursive, "Follow the structure." That's where the story lives. Her colleagues noticed, some with mild curiosity, others with discomfort. One congressman half-joked at a committee lunch, "You don't really want to be on finance, do you?" She smiled without answering. She knew better than to explain herself to someone who wasn't actually asking. At night, in the soft light of her apartment, she would stare at charts that made her feel small and stubborn at the same time. Pages filled with acronyms and assumptions, numbers designed to keep people like her away from the room. But she was in the room now. And if no one was going to translate the language of money into something the people she represented could understand, then she would learn it herself. One late evening, after hours of reading and rereading, she tucked her notes into a folder, pressed her palm flat over the cover, and whispered, not as a wish, but as a quiet promise, "I don't need their permission to ask better questions." And the next day she did. The hearing room was colder than she expected, not in temperature, though the air conditioning hummed a little too loud, but in posture. Stiff suits, stone expressions, polished shoes lined neatly beneath desks that had seen decades of deals. The brass nameplates gleamed under soft lights. Everything looked like it belonged, except maybe her. Alexandria stepped in quietly but not timidly. Her shoes, still scuffed at the toes, didn't make much sound on the marble floor, but a few heads turned anyway. She could feel it, the flickers of attention, the small glances that seemed harmless but carried the weight of assumption. She didn't wear power the way others did in that room. No designer briefcase, no expensive pen tucked into her lapel. But what she did carry was a red folder, slightly worn at the edges with a paperclip barely holding the tabs together. Inside that folder were questions, dozens of them, each handwritten over weeks of late-night study sessions, drawn from dense reports and forgotten footnotes. She hadn't written them to impress anyone. She'd written them because no one else had. As she made her way to her seat, one staffer leaned toward another and whispered something with a slight smirk. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone. It was always the tone that arrived first, the same one she heard when people called her the bartender, like it was a punchline instead of a path. She placed the red folder carefully on the desk. The person beside her, a senior member with years in that chair, gave a polite nod. "Big day," he said. She nodded back. "Every day is, for someone," she replied almost gently. The hearing was about to begin. The witness, a bank CEO with more legal advisors than most small countries, sat ready to give his opening remarks. His suit was perfect. His answers would be too. The script was familiar. He'd been here before. But this time, something was different. Alexandria opened her folder and slid her notes into place, the pages marked with color-coded tabs. Not just figures and citations, but real names. People from her district. A single mom who'd lost her home after a 17% interest rate reset. A retired teacher whose pension fund had been bundled, sold, and forgotten. They weren't theoretical. They were who she carried with her. As the questioning began, others went first. Some soft, some sharp, all practiced. Then came her name. The chair recognized her. For a moment, there was a pause. Cameras shifted slightly. The room didn't know what to expect. And maybe that was her advantage. She began slowly, not with confrontation, but with clarity, her voice calm, but anchored. She asked about financial products that didn't make headlines, about loopholes carved so quietly that no one outside the building ever noticed. And then she asked the question she had rehearsed 100 times, not because it was aggressive, but because it was necessary. If working families made the same financial decisions your institution did, would they be jailed or bailed out? There was no immediate answer, just a brief hesitation, the kind that lingers longer than silence, the kind that tells a story all by itself. The CEO cleared his throat, papers shuffled, a legal aide leaned in. Alexandria closed her folder gently, not needing to say more, because sometimes bringing the receipts wasn't about catching someone in a lie, it was about showing up with the truth, organized, thoughtful, undeniable. And in that moment, they didn't see a freshman congresswoman. They saw a girl with a red folder and the courage to use it. The hearing moved along like most others, predictable, formal, a slow rhythm of questions and responses that almost felt rehearsed. The room was full, but attention flowed in one direction, toward the senior representatives. They had the name recognition, the headlines, the practiced voices that filled the space like furniture that had always been there. Alexandria sat near the end of the panel, quiet, patient. She had been there for over an hour listening, taking notes with her pen uncapped but still untouched. Her red folder rested in front of her, already open, pages neatly aligned, questions in the order she wanted them. No bold markers, no highlighted drama, just margins filled with careful thinking. No one seemed to be watching her, and that suited her fine. This wasn't about spotlight, it was about setup. She understood something that not everyone in that room did. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait, not to attack, but to listen, closely, fully, so that when you finally speak, it lands. The bank's CEO at the witness table answered each question with ease. He leaned into familiar language: market confidence, risk tolerance, fiduciary responsibility. He used phrases that blurred blame until it disappeared entirely. A few representatives pushed harder, but it was polite, political, nothing too sharp. When it was finally her turn, Alexandria adjusted the mic gently, her voice steady from the first word. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her tone calm and unhurried. She didn't jump in. She eased into it like someone building a foundation, one block at a time. She referenced the bank's quarterly filings, line by line with precision. She connected them to foreclosures in her district. She didn't accuse. She illuminated. She made the complex visible, not to impress the committee, but to speak plainly to anyone watching who had ever overdrafted by $10 and paid $35 for it. The CEO listened, but there was a shift in his posture. He began to adjust the papers in front of him. His pen tapped the table once, lightly. He recognized what was happening, but too late to redirect. And then, without raising her voice or changing her pace, she asked the question that wasn't in the script. Not his, not the room's. "Would your bank survive," she asked softly, "if it were held to the same standards that working-class people are expected to follow every day?" The room didn't go silent, but it stopped moving. No one shifted. No one checked their phone. Even the press gallery seemed to hold its collective breath. The question was simple in form, but heavy in meaning. It didn't attack the bank's balance sheet. It questioned the system it lived in. The CEO paused. He smiled faintly, perhaps thinking the question rhetorical, but her eyes stayed steady, waiting for an answer. There was no fallback for him, no pre-approved language that could make it go away. He leaned forward. "Well, Congresswoman, He stopped, looked down. Alexandria said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her silence now did more than another round of questioning. It left space. The kind of space where people, for once, could hear the answer that wasn't spoken. And just like that, she leaned back. No gloating. No glance around the room for approval. Just a quiet return to stillness, her pen back in her hand. Because she hadn't come to perform. She came to ask the question no one else had dared to. And that, in a room full of voices, was the moment they realized they had underestimated the quietest one. The question hovered in the air, unhurried but unrelenting. It didn't echo. It settled. Not with thunder, but with weight. The kind of weight that doesn't shout, but leans gently into a room until no one can look away. Across the long table, the bank's CEO blinked. Once, then again. The smile he'd worn for most of the hearing, a polite practice curve, began to flatten. His fingers, previously resting still on the polished wood, now tapped lightly against the edge of his prepared statement. His other hand adjusted the knot of his tie, even though it didn't need fixing. For a moment, no one spoke. The other committee members didn't shift. Reporters in the press row stopped typing. Staffers leaned forward slightly, unsure if this was the pause before a polite deflection or something else entirely. The room had changed, not dramatically but precisely, as if a new kind of attention had arrived. Sharper, quieter, more honest. He cleared his throat. "Congresswoman?" He looked down, then at his counsel seated just behind him. She leaned forward, whispered something too low to hear, and slid a note across the table. He didn't read it. Instead, he looked up and tried again. That's a complicated question," he said, his voice just a bit tighter now. I'd need more time to answer that fully." Alexandria didn't interrupt. She didn't tilt her head or narrow her eyes. She just stayed exactly as she was, composed, attentive, still. No rebuttal, no need. Because sometimes the most powerful answer is no answer at all. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. It allowed the moment to breathe, to land in the chest of every person in that room and every viewer watching beyond it. The question had done its work. It didn't need a raised voice to matter. It just needed to be asked plainly and left to sit. And now it was sitting, right in the middle of the committee room, between polished suits and decades of procedure, where no one could quite sweep it aside. The CEO adjusted his papers again, as though reordering them might reorder the question too. But it didn't go anywhere. In the corner of the room, a congressional aide typed slower now, watching more than recording. A fellow representative, once half distracted by emails, now tapped a pen thoughtfully against his notepad. The tone of the hearing had shifted, not toward confrontation, but toward consequence. Alexandria offered a small nod. Not smug, not dismissive, just acknowledging the moment for what it was, a turning point that didn't need to announce itself. And then she smiled. It wasn't a victory smile. It wasn't performative. It was quiet and grounded, the kind that said, "This isn't about catching you. It's about showing who's being protected and who isn't." She closed her red folder gently, sliding her pen back into the crease where her notes lived. Her job wasn't to win the hearing. It was to ask the question millions of Americans had never heard in a room like this. Now they had. The chair called for the next member. The hearing moved on, but the moment stayed, and somewhere in that building of marble and history, the foundations had shifted, just a little, not loudly, but enough for those paying attention to feel it. She hadn't even planned to watch it again. The hearing had ended, the folder was closed, and the day had carried on like it always did. A meeting, some emails, a quiet ride home. She'd taken off her shoes at the door, set her bag on the floor beside her coat, and made a simple dinner. Rice, black beans, a squeeze of lime. Nothing dramatic, nothing special. But the clip had already begun to move without her. It started with a few texts, friends sending screenshots, cousins forwarding links. "You're everywhere. I saw you on my feed before I even had coffee. Did you see what you did?" She didn't reply right away, just read them slowly, carefully, like one might read a letter from someone they haven't seen in years. It wasn't the fact that the video was spreading, it was how it was spreading, quietly, organically, from people who weren't pundits or insiders, people who didn't always watch hearings, who maybe didn't even know what committee she sat on, and yet they were sharing it. No special effects, no dramatic edits. Just a clip of her voice, calm, clear, asking one question. Would your bank survive if it were held to the same standards as working class people? It wasn't the question itself that made people pause. It was the tone, the stillness, the simplicity. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't rushed. She had simply asked what had long gone unsaid in rooms like that. And overnight, it traveled. It showed up in Facebook groups for public school teachers, on WhatsApp chains between grocery workers and night shift nurses, in quiet corners of Twitter where someone would say, "This is what being seen sounds like." The views ticked upward, tens of thousands, then hundreds, then more. But she didn't focus on the number. She was reading the comments. Short, often quiet, sometimes misspelled, sometimes just emojis, but honest. I've waited years to hear someone ask that. I didn't know politicians were even allowed to speak like this. She sounds like she knows my story. Back in the Capitol, things were quieter in a different way. Some colleagues offered nods, polite acknowledgments. Others avoided eye contact. The press ran their headlines, each trying to capture the moment with varying degrees of caution. Rising star or reckless freshman? AOC asks the question that stops the room. Bank CEO falters under calm pressure. But she wasn't thinking about headlines. She was thinking about Miss Rivera, who'd once told her that sometimes change starts with a question no one else is willing to ask. That night, after the lights were off and her dishes were clean, Alexandria sat by the window, her phone face down on the table. Outside, the Bronx carried on as it always had. Buses hissed. A baby cried in the apartment next door. Music played faintly from a passing car. She didn't need applause. She didn't need noise. What she felt was quieter, but firmer. Not victory, not fame. Just a quiet sense that somewhere, people were watching and whispering to themselves. She asked that for me. And in that, she knew the clip didn't just go viral. It went home. There was no shouting, no memos, no headlines. Just a shift in tone, barely audible. A few murmurs over catered lunches, lowered voices in back hallways, polite nods masking uneasy glances. But the message traveled far and clear. She's moving too fast. The country's not ready for someone like her. Politics isn't a place for ideals that pure. Nothing direct, nothing public, just quiet exclusion. A fundraiser canceled without explanation. A campaign consultant forgot to return a call. A trusted colleague gently advised, maybe it's best to sit this one out. It wasn't betrayal, it was fear. She had seen fear before, in eviction notices, in empty fridges, in her mother's hands scrubbing counters late into the night. But this fear was different. It wore suits, smiled for cameras, and sent polite emails with cold intent. Some donors began whispering conditions. Some allies began fading from her side. Not because they didn't believe in her, but because they knew the cost of standing too close. One night, her phone lit up with a message from a candidate she had once helped. They just called. Said, if I keep endorsing you, they'll pull all my funding. I'm sorry. She stared at the screen for a while. No anger, no reply, just understanding. She didn't blame them, but she didn't bend either. Instead of hitting back, she went quiet. Not in defeat, but in strategy. She met with voters in church basements and borrowed classrooms, asked questions, took notes. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She just sharpened it. At one small gathering, a woman with silver hair asked gently, "Are you okay, Karita?" She smiled. If it's getting harder, it means we're doing something right. The room laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. She knew what they were afraid of. Not her tone, not her questions, but what might happen if those questions started getting answers. Sometimes late at night, she'd scroll past rejections, past headlines that left her out. And she'd remember a kid in the Bronx tugging on her sleeve. You look like my mom, and you talk like people listen. That was enough. She didn't storm the gates. She didn't burn bridges. She just kept walking, quiet, persistent. A soft knock on a locked door, again and again, until those on the other side could no longer pretend they hadn't heard. She turned down every flashy interview. Producers kept calling, promising big slots and brighter stages, Sunday morning panels, late-night talk shows, even international segments. One of them offered to fly her first class to Los Angeles, just for 10 minutes of fire. But fire, she thought, wasn't something you packaged into a soundbite. Instead, she stayed in New York, stayed in Queens, stayed in the Bronx, folding chairs, church basements, school gyms that smelled like history and struggle. No glam squad, just her and a hand-worn folder, the same red one she carried into her first hearings. In East Elmhurst, a ceiling fan spun slowly over a group of elders. A woman with deep lines on her face leaned forward after the third question and whispered to her friend, "She talks like we do, not like she studied us, like she is us." At a laundromat drop-in meeting, yes, a laundromat, a man working 2 jobs asked, Why don't you go on TV more? She looked him straight in the eye. Because this right here isn't a performance. He blinked, then nodded, then stayed for the whole thing. Every town hall she opened with listening, not speeches, not applause lines, just stories. A boy in Flushing told her his dad got deported. A mother in Sunnyside cried when talking about insulin prices. A subway operator in Soundview said, "You know what's rare? A politician who doesn't flinch when someone's mad." She flinched sometimes, but she never left. She carried a little notebook where she jotted down names. Not just policies, names. It mattered to her that these people weren't bullet points in a press kit. They were reasons, anchors. And still, the cameras followed, even from outside. A local paper ran a piece titled, "She Vanished from Cable News," and became louder than ever. AOC read it, smiled lightly, then put the clipping in her drawer and got back to work. Because the real noise wasn't online. It was in the hush of a parent debating groceries or rent, in the voice of a nurse explaining how she hides exhaustion behind a mask, in the fingers of a student tracing the numbers on her FAFSA form like they were some cruel riddle. This wasn't the kind of fire that roared. It was the kind that stayed lit in wind. One evening, at a town hall in Jackson Heights, a mother, her accent heavy, her pride heavier, stood and spoke slowly. "You talk like us. You fight like we wish we could. And when you sit in that big room in Washington, don't you ever forget, some of us are still out here just trying to be heard." AOC nodded. Something in her chest pulled tight, then steadied. Later that night, alone, she walked back through the neighborhood, past bodegas with flickering lights, past windows where smells of arroz con gandules drifted into the street. She thought of that mother. She thought of her own. And then she whispered to no one, or maybe to everyone, "I haven't forgotten. I never will." She could have been anywhere in the world that week, but she chose to be here. Not because it was easier, but because this was the whole point. The job, she knew, wasn't just to speak for the people. It was to stand beside them until the mic reached their hands. The envelope had no return address, just a smudged postmark from West Virginia and handwriting that looked like it had seen a lifetime of coal dust and calluses. She opened it on a quiet morning, tea cooling beside her, sunlight bleeding gently across the windowsill of her modest apartment. There wasn't much in the envelope, just a single sheet of lined paper, folded neatly, like it had been held onto for a few days before being sent. It began simply. "Didn't vote for you." She paused. Her instinct braced for what usually came next, but the next sentence pulled her in. "But when you asked that man, that banker, if his institution could survive under the same rules as the rest of us," I stood up in my kitchen. She reread the line twice. Stood up in my kitchen. It wasn't applause. It was recognition. And from someone who, by all accounts, had every reason to stay quiet. The letter continued. "Worked 37 years underground. Voted red, most of them. Figured folks like you didn't understand people like me. But something about the way you sat in that chair, small but not small, and asked the question like it belonged to all of us, it made me feel like maybe it was the first time someone saw what it's like to be on the other end of power." Her hand trembled slightly as she turned the page over. "Still don't agree with everything you say, but I don't doubt you mean it. That counts more than I thought it did. Thank you for showing up." There was no signature, just one last line scribbled at the bottom. "We're not that different. Maybe just raised in different zip codes." She didn't cry right away. Not the dramatic kind of cry people expect when the underdog wins something. It was smaller, softer. The kind that comes from being seen by someone who once stood across from you and decided to take a step closer. AOC folded the letter slowly, placing it beside the red folder on her desk. She thought about how many times she'd been told she didn't belong, how many rooms had rolled their eyes before she even spoke, how many reporters still called her performative without sitting through a single town hall. But this letter didn't come from a newsroom. It came from a kitchen, from a man with soot in his lungs and dignity in his bones. And it was worth more than all the headlines combined. That night, during a team meeting, she quietly slid the letter across the table to one of her aides. No explanation, just a soft nod. The aide read it, then looked up and whispered, He stood up in his kitchen. They both smiled. In the months that followed, AOC would return to that phrase often. When critics grew louder, when party elders sent warnings through veiled advice, when lobbyists tried to wrap compromise in ribbons of convenience, she'd think, if someone who never voted for me can feel something shift, maybe we're not shouting into a void. Maybe we're slowly changing the shape of it. And so she kept the letter close, not framed, not flaunted, just folded neatly and carried, sometimes in her folder, sometimes in her purse, always within reach. Because more than policy or power or polls, that letter reminded her what this was really about. Not proving herself right, but proving that connection is possible, even across lines drawn in old ink. And when the days got hard, and they always did, she'd read that one line again. I stood up in my kitchen, not because she needed validation, but because it meant that somewhere, someone who didn't expect to feel seen, did. The vote had ended an hour ago, but the air still held its tension like static after a storm. The echoes of raised voices and quick gavel strikes had faded, replaced now by the distant murmur of staffers clearing papers and reporters filing their sound bites. Alexandria walked slowly down the marble corridor, the click of her shoes the only sound accompanying her. The hallway stretched long and grand, made to intimidate, she'd always thought, not to welcome. Portraits of past power lined the walls, stern faces, heavy frames, names she'd once memorized in civics class, now known more for what they overlooked than what they built. Her hands were empty, no phone, no notes, just a quiet that wrapped around her shoulders like an old shawl. Behind her, someone muttered, not even hiding it, she'll never be speaker. It wasn't cruel, just condescending, the kind of thing that wasn't meant to hurt, only to reduce. She stopped for a moment, not to argue, just to breathe, then turned her head slightly, voice calm, soft, clear. That was never the point. She kept walking, not toward power, but through it. Years ago, that comment might have landed differently, shaken something, bruised a little pride. But not today. Today, she'd cast a vote knowing exactly what it cost her in terms of alliances, but she'd also known who it protected. That clarity was its own kind of strength. As she rounded the corner toward her office, she passed a janitor she saw most evenings. He gave her a tired smile, and she returned it with one of her own. No speeches, no fanfare, just mutual recognition. Two people still working when most others had gone home. In her office, the lights were low. A tiny desk lamp illuminated a stack of handwritten letters. No press team had filtered them. No intern had drafted replies yet. She picked one at random and opened it slowly. This one was from a teacher in Detroit. My students watched your banking committee clip. One of them, shy kid, barely speaks, said, she talks like my auntie, but she's in charge. I've never seen him sit up straighter. AOC smiled. That's what mattered. She thought back to her very first day on the Hill, wearing borrowed heels and carrying secondhand hopes. How many had doubted her, laughed at her, mispronounced her name like it was a joke instead of a legacy. But the letter still came, and the question still burned in her chest. She turned to the window. Outside, the Capitol dome stood lit against the navy sky. It was beautiful, sure, but not invincible. Not immune to being reshaped by those bold enough to imagine it otherwise. She sat, pen in hand, and began scribbling notes. Not policy, not rebuttals. Just reminders. Keep showing up. Don't speak to impress. Speak to reveal. Some halls are grand because of who walks them, not who built them. Let them underestimate. It's quieter that way. She folded the note and tucked it into her folder. Tomorrow there'd be another committee hearing, another round of side eyes and snide remarks, another chance to ask the question no one else would. But tonight, she was alone in the quiet, not defeated, not distracted, just steady. Because while some measured victory in titles and podiums, she had learned to measure it in moments of resonance, in the silent nods, the rising spines, the private awakenings sparked by public courage. And in those terms, she was winning. Not the kind of winning that gets broadcast with breaking banners and campaign music. The kind of winning that walks down an empty Capitol hallway, hears doubt, and smiles anyway. Because the echo of that doubt is nothing next to the quiet certainty she carries. The work is the point. The people are the prize. And the heart, even when alone, is full. The bell above the door chimed just the same. Same booth near the window. Same scuff marks on the floor behind the bar. The neighborhood had changed in bits. New graffiti, a vegan spot where the old deli used to be, but the heart of it hadn't moved an inch. She didn't come with cameras or a crowd, just herself and a moment of quiet. The bar smelled like citrus and memory. Someone was tuning the jukebox in the back. She took a seat on the last stool at the end of the counter, the one she used to wipe down at midnight with tired wrists and dreams too big for the tips she was making. Behind the bar now was a young woman, maybe 22, maybe younger, wearing hoops, a ponytail, and an NYU sweatshirt that had clearly seen better days. She didn't say anything at first, just poured a glass of water and set it down. Then, eyes still half focused on a rag she was folding, she whispered like she didn't want to spook the truth. "You make me feel like maybe I belong too." AOC looked at her, really looked, past the nerves, past the doubt, into the flicker of someone trying to believe they had a place in the world not designed with them in mind. She smiled. Not the practice kind, but the one she used to give customers who told her to keep the change when it mattered. "Good," she said, "because you already do." The jukebox clicked to life. Something old school. Someone laughed in the booth near the front, and for a minute, just a minute, it didn't feel like returning. It felt like never having left. She stood at the edge of the rooftop, the skyline stretching out like a promise and a dare. Queens below her breathed in twilight, stoops lit with porch lights, windows glowing with dinners in progress. Somewhere down there, a girl just like she once was might be finishing a shift or opening a textbook with tired hands. The wind tugged gently at the sleeves of her jacket. It smelled like summer coming early. Warm tar, trees in bloom, something electric. She didn't speak at first, just closed her eyes, took in the hum of the city that made her, bruised her, lifted her. And then, as if the silence asked permission, she answered. They mistook quiet for weakness, but silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the wind before the storm. There was no applause, no camera crews, just sky and grit, and the knowing in her bones that what she was building would outlive applause anyway. Because it was never about the seat. It was never about the headlines. It was never even about her. It was about the waitress who had to choose between bus fare and groceries, the abuela who circled rent dates in pencil, the coal miner who stood up in his kitchen, the student who looked at her and said, "Maybe I belong too." A flicker of orange crossed her face as the sun slipped behind Manhattan's edge. She turned to leave, but before the rooftop emptied, a message lingered, soft, sure, unshakable. She couldn't afford rent. Now she helps write the rules. This story reminds us that power doesn't always wear a suit or speak from a podium. Sometimes it wears borrowed shoes and carries questions written in a red folder. AOC's journey isn't just political, it's deeply human. It speaks to anyone who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told they didn't belong. Her path shows that real change often begins in quiet places, over a bar counter, at a kitchen table, in a laundromat printing flyers. It's a reminder that courage is contagious, and one voice, grounded in truth, can echo far beyond expectation. What's one quiet decision you made that ended up changing everything? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters, and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.